Yeah, hi, I'm Dana Ward. I go by Dan, and I'm 75. I was born August 23rd, 49, and in San Jose, California. My mom was married four times, three times while I was in the house. So it was not a stable childhood by any stretch of the imagination. My parents divorced when I was four, and I don't really remember much about those early years. But then she married uh, a guy who was Italian, who was the butcher in his family corner grocery store. So that basically is the environment that I grew up in from age 5 to 13. They got divorced when I was 13. But it was working class. He was a butcher, although, his parents owned the store. He eventually inherited. So petty bourgeois, but it was really the Lupin proletariat. He was a bookie, so he ran book out of the butcher shop, and played the ponies and things like that. And my mother was working as a soft water saleswoman and met a guy 9 years her younger, very dynamic Paul Newman type guy, drove a powder blue uh, Cadillac convertible, and they started a relationship that ended marriage. And then they got married, and it was annulled within 9 months after he basically robbed us of everything, including the coin collection my grandfather had given me. Um, and then she married, and then so that was when I was 13, 14. And so throughout high school, it was just my mom as a single mom, and my sister, full sister, and a half sister from the Frank Bottini, the butcher. And anyway, I was an athlete, and that was my way out in South San Francisco. I wanted to play football, and so I went to Berkeley, played football. I got my knee ruined, but in the process also became politicized. This was 1967, and ruined my knee in 68. But I got a season of football in, and uh, started to look at my studies a little more seriously after I got injured, because any hope for athletic career was over. And I had always been a reader. That was kind of my refuge. And my childhood, I would go to the library and come home with four books, which was the most you could come out and take out, and I'd be back as soon as I was done with those. And, went through a lot of reading, I guess, kind of to get me out of my world. And at Berkeley, of course, this was 67 to 71, so those were some pretty radical and radicalizing years, and I was caught up in that, and got involved with the anti-war movement, got involved with People's Park, got shot during People's Park in the ass, and basically at that point, I considered myself a Marxist. I kind of read my way into Marx. I'd always been interested in political philosophy and law and so forth, and I had pretty much decided that Marx had the right economic analysis. He wasn't great on a lot of things that I objected to. And during the Cambodian invasion, they were choosing representatives, and I was one of the representatives. And they asked me, to describe my politics, and I said I was a Marxist, but I have trouble with the dictatorship of the proletariat and the role of peasants in revolution, and the role of the Lupin proletariat, et cetera, et cetera. And afterwards, a guy walked up to me and said, "You're not a Marxist, you're an anarchist." And I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" I had not, the word anarchy to me meant chaos. I hadn't encountered anything other than Marx's screed against Proudhon. And which is odd because everything useful in Marx comes from Proudhon. But anyway, I kind of took him seriously, and I picked up some Murray Bookchin, and Murray Bookchin made me an anarchist. both basically down in 71. I had started school at Chicago and getting a master's in political science, a PhD program. And I went down to the Yucatan on spring break and brought one of Bookchin's books with me, including the essay Listen Marxists. And well, the rest is, I then read my way into anarchism. And at the time, I knew nobody who was an anarchist, and really it would be decades until I ever met another anarchist, not until the 90s. And so in 71, I graduated, went to Chicago, spent 2 years there, got a master's degree, then went to Yale, got a double PhD in psychology and political science. And right after, let's see, I guess this is 73, I went to Yale. In 75, we bought land up here, the land that I'm on right now. 76, we got married. And late 76, we went to Afghanistan, spent 2.5 years there. Our first child was born there. And then 2 years in Sierra Leone, and came back and started my academic career at St. Joe's in Philadelphia for 1 year, and then Pitzer for the next 40. So that's kind of my academic career. And over the time at Pitzer, I spent a great deal of time overseas, every chance we got, really. Whenever I had a sabbatical, I'd always take a leave of absence as well. And so we spent 2 years in China and 2 years in Japan, 2.5 in Afghanistan, 2 in Sierra Leone, a year in Vietnam, 2 years in Japan, 6 months in Bhutan, 6 months in Turkey, a couple years altogether in Latin America in shorter stints. So that's kind of my upbringing and academic background. It wasn't until my freshman year at Berkeley, and it was in December of 67, and PBS had a documentary on the Vietnam War that just tore me apart. So my entry into radical politics is actually anti-war politics. So I was, against the Vietnam War. I was a draft resistor. So that's what Vietnam politicized me. Berkeley radicalized me. Chicago educated me, and Yale socialized me. Kind of my experience in those two places. So Berkeley is responsible for putting me on a radical trajectory, and in the process, I gravitated towards Marxism, which at the time was, fairly popular. And it wasn't until much later that I realized that anarchism was the older and more important historical movement. Most of my activities up until the 90s was anti-war activity. I taught courses on Central America, so I was heavily involved speaking against the Reagan wars against the nations of Central America, and anti-apartheid stuff in the 80s. We did sanctuary work. I kind of led the charge on having Pitzer be the first sanctuary college for Central American refugees, and we helped a few families. Not, it wasn't a big deal, but we did a little bit. And so that was, my political activities have always been oriented towards foreign policy, anti-interventionist, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist work. And so in Chicago, after I'd kind of decided, oh yeah, right, I am an anarchist, that's when I got serious about reading anarchism and read pretty systematically about it. In the 90s, a lot of my students were starting to become quite radical at Pitzer, and a number of them got involved with the WTO strike and so forth, and in the late 90s. But in the mid 90s, I spent a couple of years in Japan, and for odd reasons, those years led me to the internet. My students really could speak English. They were supposed to be fluent, but they could read, but they couldn't really speak. So I turned to the internet to kind of teach. And my wife and I were teaching together at that point, and we developed this kind of internet-based approach to learning English language and politics. And that led to the establishment of Anarchy Archives. So while we were in Japan, we had a 3-month break that led me to London, and I found some works of Godwin in the antique bookstores, and came back to Japan and started scanning that and some of Kropotkin's work, and started scanning it and putting it online in 95 and 96. So this was just at the beginning of the internet, and I taught myself HTML. And when we got back to California in the fall of 96, I developed a course that I started teaching in 97 called Anarchy in the Internet. And Anarchy in the Internet, it was how we developed Anarchy Archives, which for quite a while was the largest anarchist repository of material on the internet. But others are larger now. But anyway, this class, the idea was just as Proudhon read his way into anarchism, setting type. I reasoned that students could learn about anarchism and learn how to write web pages and so forth by putting the works of the anarchists online. So the goal was to create the collected works of the anarchists. And I taught that course from 95 until I retired in 2012. No, from 95, from 98, sorry, from 98 to 2012. And every year I taught that course, except we were away for a bit of that time. But anyway, that's how Anarchy Archives developed. Every week, students scanned their work. We marked it up, proofread it, so forth and so on. And as a result, they developed a pretty good anarchist culture at Pitzer. And we sponsored an anarchist gathering. When was that? Maybe 2001 or two, something like that. But then what was important next is when the Anarchist Studies Network and the North American Anarchist Association, those were two kind of academic activist association, professional activist associations, and in the Anarchist Studies Network is actually a part of the Professional Political Science Association in Britain, and they started putting on annual conferences, and so that's where I began to meet lots of other anarchists and get involved in anarchist movements, and got involved with projects in various places. But most of my activity is been disseminating anarchist literature through Anarchy Archives. Anarchism is, well, in Godwin's terms, it's self-sovereignty. Each individual is a sovereign, and each effort to coerce or command is an invasion of that sovereignty. And the American anarchists, the Boston anarchists, not the Chicago anarchists, but the Boston anarchists really took that seriously. And Josiah Warren developed a pretty robust theory of anarchism well before Proudhon, and he predates Proudhon, and in many ways anticipates him in terms of the currents, his use of labor notes and People's Bank and that sort of thing. But anyway, my understanding of anarchism is an emphasis on freedom, but an equal emphasis upon equality. They're really two sides of the same coin, and that's something that I developed before I was even radicalized. It was an idea that somehow stuck with me, that you can have freedom without equality is license, and equality without freedom is slavery. So the logical extension of that principle would be a communalistic sort of social arrangement, and a society based on mutual aid is one in which sovereignty is best preserved and maintained and put to use. So the basic principles of non-hierarchical, autonomous, um, self-organizing, mutual aid. Those are the principles upon which I think not that society not only once was organized upon, but that we will eventually become organized upon again. And I strongly believe that natural psychological development is from dependency to autonomy, and I think that the social development will follow. And it's a one step forward, two step back, maybe kind of process, or maybe two and one, whatever. But I think over the long run, the natural tendency of personal and social development is towards autonomy. Now, my critique of Marxism is just that: is that it is a command, it's a authoritarian kind of system, and it's not just a question of left or right in terms of your attitude towards capital. It's a question of whether you're authoritarian or anti-authoritarian. So there's really two matrix upon which political ideologies are organized. And those are the two: the economic capital orientation and the authoritarian orientation. I've been teaching that for a long, long time. But the Marxist problem is, the idea that, well, everything useful in Marx comes from Proudhon, and all the bullshit comes from Hegel. So the dialectic, the determinism, the stages of history, that's all a bunch of garbage. The economic analysis about surplus value and labor as the basis of capital, that all comes from Proudhon, and I think it's still very much the case that the only thing that produces capital is labor, and labor should be in control of what it produces. And in the Marxists, they share a kind of end vision of that kind of communal, egalitarian, horizontal society, but their way of getting there is highly authoritarian. And basically, I don't believe that it's ever possible to reach anti-authoritarian ends with authoritarian means. So that's my basic critique of Marx, is that he's absolutely right about alienation of labor, but all of that comes from Proudhon. So the role of peasants is another major failing in Marx's ideology. He kind of viewed peasants as potatoes in a sack. The only thing that united them was their condition. They could never develop a radical ideology. And of course, the anarchists, particularly Kropotkin and Bakunin, knew better, because they, even though they were part of the nobility, for personal reasons, each of them were intimately related with peasant culture and society. And they knew that peasants could develop their own radical critique, and there was more to unite peasants than their condition. And I think history has shown that peasants have played an overwhelmingly important role in the Chinese Revolution, the Spanish Revolution, the revolution in Ukraine, and so forth. So Nicaraguan, El Salvadoran, and so forth. So he was dead wrong about the role of peasants in terms of revolutionary consciousness. The withering away of the state. There's states develop interests of their own, and their principal interest is to maintain their status and their power. So the idea that a state will wither away or be allowed to wither away by those in control, I think is wishful thinking at best. The whole idea that history is deterministic. We are certainly shaped by our past, but we are determined by the choices we make in the present. So revolutionary consciousness, autonomy, revolutionary understanding is how we move forward. What else about Marx? That's enough about him. Well, that's kind of a refrain that all throughout my career is that I'm an anarchist, but we don't live in an anarchist society. We can move towards that in micro steps. We can create as much autonomous space as possible, but it's a long slog, and I don't think violent revolution is the way to achieve anarchism. I think we build the alternative society by building the alternative society. That is by creating systems of mutual aid, systems that are based upon participatory democracy, things like what happened in Argentina in the 80s, the recuperative factory movement, where people got together and they organized themselves and really managed their own affairs. So I think it is possible to move in that direction slowly, particularly on the economic front. I think worker-owned and operated enterprises are the way of the future. They've been growing and growing and growing, and they're only getting more effective. I'm thinking of things like Mondragon and the recuperative factories, or the old plywood industry in the United States, or Johnny Selected Seeds just right down the road from me. Anyway, so for me, anarchism is a moral guide. It's a way of trying to relate to others in a non-authoritarian, non-hierarchical, non-domination, um, form of interaction. And so that's guided my principles, and I've tried to be as autonomous as possible. So there's a number of people that influenced me who weren't necessarily anarchists, and the most important probably was Scott Nearing. Scott Nearing was a back-to-lander in the 1930s. He's one of the witnesses in the movie Reds, the great masterpiece about Jack Reed, Warren Beatty's masterpiece. He was a back-to-the-lander, grew up in New York and was a labor organizer and so forth, but then moved to Vermont initially, built his own home, and developed a philosophy of working half a day to meet your basic needs and the other half your creative and social responsibilities. And so he learned how to weave, how to grow his own food, build his own houses, etc. He developed a slip form method of stone construction. And what you see behind me there is that construction at work. Um, so in 1985, I started building this house, used the materials from the land as much as possible, including stone and some of the timber. But the idea was to be self-sufficient. I think that this is something that I took from Jefferson. Jefferson's concept of agrarian democracy was based upon each individual family being autonomous, being able to produce and meet, sufficiently to meet their own needs, so that they could never be bought by someone else. They would never be dependent on someone else. So this idea of autonomy is something that goes long before I was interested in anarchism. And so part of my of how anarchism has affected my life is that every summer I came up here and I spent half my time, well, 3 summers it was full-time work, but the rest of the time was half the time working on the house and the homestead, trails in the forest and so forth, and the other half writing. And like, I'm not nearly as prolific as Nearing. He ended up writing 90 books on a wide variety of subjects. But it was a way of organizing my day-to-day life that I found very satisfying. So since I retired and we're now living here 6 months of the year, we started growing all of our own food. Although this year I'm going to have to stop because I'm physically just not able to do this stuff anymore. So the idea of do it yourself, that is, which has become a very important part of the anarchist movement. that guided at least 3 months of the year when I was here summer, and the rest of the time, of course, I'm a professor. So I have academic demands that make it impossible to live the ideal life. But now we're getting there. Well, it's funny because what I always say is that I learned more about the United States by traveling abroad. Um, you really get a better perspective, I think, on how your own society is organized by looking at other societies and seeing how they're organized. And I think the most important thing I learned is that everybody is motivated by the same love of family, the same desire to be free, same desire to be respected. The Afghan, we felt very much welcomed and embraced in Afghan culture, for example. And we still have many friends from those days. The Afghans who came to the United States and ended up in Southern California. There's three families, and now three generations of those families that we've maintained close contact with, and we celebrate Thanksgiving together every Thanksgiving for the last 40 years. So understanding that regardless of where you come from, family and respect and being able to take care of yourself are universal values. And I've seen the damage that's been done by U.S. imperialism. And I could go into a number of details, but it's clear that the United States has not been a force for good overseas. It's been very much a force for violence and oppression. So I've become more and more aware of that the more I learn about the countries that we traveled in.